Thank you all for coming to this second of a series of seminars that we're doing for Reimagining Contemporary Ministries for Renewing Church. And the point of these seminars is for those who are able to gather, those who can watch afterwards on video, to introduce some of the main themes that we're addressing as part of our Lilly Endowment funded project here at Trinity to renew our curriculum around certain key initiatives. And one of the key ones that we're looking at today is the idea of the diverse body that is the church, right? The diversity that has always been, but sometimes too often, almost always set aside, marginalized, excluded from our thinking about the church. And so as we renew our curriculum, as we renew our programs and facilities and formation of students for ministry here, we wanted to make sure that diversity in the body of the church was a kind of core part of what we were doing. So the idea is that we ensure that a church that is post-Christendom, as we have moved into, moves beyond its past collusion with power and systemic injustice. And so to that end, part of the initiative is to fund the creation of advisors and partners who will come on board here at Trinity, participate in Divinity Council, do worship leading in the chapel, do leading retreats, some support for students, that sort of thing. And so we're bringing them on for the next few years, and we have an opportunity today to welcome at least one of them today, who is Randy Williams. And I'll give Randy a moment to introduce himself in a little bit, as we begin our discussion around these issues. So there will be advisors appointed from three different groups that represent essentially the three most dominant ethnic groups in Southern Ontario that are not well represented in church and theology and hierarchy and that sort of thing. And those would be Indigenous, African Canadian, and Chinese Canadian. And obviously, one of the contexts for this, as we thought about how we would renew our program here at Trinity, is events like we've seen in the last couple of years. In the wake of the death of George Floyd, people of color in Canadian churches raised once again the ongoing issue of racism in the church. And prominent among this response has been Black Anglicans of Canada, based in Toronto and led by members of the diocese here. And that organization laments the failure of the church to implement the recommendations of a report from 1994 on racism in the Anglican Church, and highlights what is unfortunately still a small number of people of color amongst clergy and theological students. Of course, at the same time, we have ongoing revelations over church-run residential schools and Indigenous Canadians and their involvement in that. It continues to be a scandal for the country, as well as the kind of limited substantive response to implementing recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which the final report of which was now 7 years ago. The report includes a call not only to decolonialize government and church structures, but also theological curriculum, right, for training church leaders for the post-colonial Canadian context. And so those are the kind of immediate issues that surround us, but I wanted to start even deeper in a way with the fact that when I think about these things, they all represent what is, properly speaking, a failure of the church, right? So the fact that there is something called Black Anglicans of Canada, that there are, there's Black Lives Matter, or that there's, people working to get justice for Indigenous people in Canada, all of these represent profound failures on the part of the church, on the part of our cooperation, collaboration with the mission of God. And so these are not just simply the issues of the moment. These are not issues that are about our day or the kinds of crises that we're facing as a church. They really go to the heart of what Christian ministry and mission and witness to the world is all about. And so I thought, just as a way of kind of thinking a little bit about this before we have our discussion today and our speakers, take you back to the early church and the way that this was very much at the forefront of the apostolic mission. How do we have a church that is united, but nevertheless reflects the diversity of the world around us, diversity in all kinds of different ways. And although diversity and the way we think about race today does not exist in the ancient world. It's a modern construct, we have to say. Nevertheless, issues of diversity and unity have always plagued the church. It's kind of easy to do one and not the other, right? If you wanted a united church, you can just ignore diversity and let's let all of the different groups fold into one kind of central structure. That's what we call colonialism, essentially, right? The power structure at the center of things. Or on the other hand, we could do diversity without bothering with unity, right? But it's this idea of differentiated unity or united diversity that really is at the heart not only of the early apostolic mission, it's really at the heart of God's plan for the world, for creation. So I want to just take us for a moment to Ephesians, where St. Paul lays this out over a couple of chapters here. At the beginning of the epistle, he talks about the fact that God's plan for all of creation in Christ, the very mystery of his will, is in the fullness of time to gather all things up in him, things in heaven and things on earth. So that's the totality of everything, united, gathered up. And the consequences of that are spelled out in the second chapter, where St. Paul speaks about Christ being our peace, and that in his flesh he has broken down the dividing wall, that hostility between us. And he's speaking particularly in this context about Jews and Greeks, Jews and Gentiles. But this really extends to all thinking about diversity and creating in himself one new humanity in place of the two, making peace, reconciling both to God in one body through the cross, putting to death the hostility through it. So we have this image of this beautiful unity as God gathers in Christ heaven and earth and all things from all of the diversity, all the oppositions coming into one thing. But where he goes after that is what's most telling. And that is that St. Paul talks about his mission. And his mission is to bring to the world the boundless riches of Christ, to make everyone see this plan, right? This plan that is that mystery hidden for ages in God who created all things, so that through the church, the wisdom of God in its rich variety might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. So the very center and core of the church's mission to the world is the wisdom of God in its rich variety. Okay? So the sign that the kingdom is coming has come in Christ, inaugurated, yet to be fulfilled, when all things will be all in all, as St. Paul says. The very sign is a kind of differentiated unity. All things caught up in Christ, but in this rich variety. Now, the word St. Paul uses for rich variety is telling. As I say, this is some 16 centuries before the modern era invented racism, right? Black and white, racism was not an issue in the ancient world. There were slaves, sure, but they were slaves because your king lost the battle, no matter what color of skin it was, or because of of poverty and that sort of thing. But what's telling about that word for rich variety, polypikilos, is it literally means many colored. Many colored. That in the churches representing the diversity of humanity, and you think today about all the things that many colors represents, of course race, but also other issues of identity and so forth, that in the church, polypikilos is the eschatological sign that we are doing the right thing, that work of God, the mystery hidden from all the ages, is that we have that differentiated unity. So that's what we mean by rich diversity in the church. This isn't just like the contemporary issue, the thing we need to do because it's politically appropriate. Or this is the key sign of what it is to be church. And I think it's important for us to remember that as we embark on this kind of initiative. The last thing I just wanted to say by way of introduction today is that we have already at Trinity a great amount of that diversity. So when we say that we're doing this initiative, it's not to say we're starting something. I think we're already trying to listen to different groups from different perspectives and that sort of thing. The fact that Trinity for 20 years now has had an Eastern Christian Studies program with people from representing indigenous churches from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and so forth, is a sign that that diversity is already in play here. We've maybe not overlooked, but certainly undersold that as a real gift, I think, as a Faculty of Divinity, that we have the opportunity to study theology together from all these different perspectives. So what the initiative is about is breaking down the kind of centralized one way of doing things, that unity without diversity and so forth. So if we can build on our existing strengths. And today, right across the faculty, we have students from all different backgrounds. It's really, really exciting to see. I really, as somebody who teaches in the classroom, welcome the kind of different perspectives that variety and diversity brings. We have so much to learn from one another. So I see this as being a really important part of what we do together as Trinity College, as a Faculty of Divinity in the coming years, to create a strong theological program where people can come and learn from all these different perspectives, but with this idea in mind, that we can properly minister within a church, doing what church was supposed to have been doing all along, not continuing to fail and continuing to ignore God's mission to the world, but properly being that eschatological sign of differentiated unity and united diversity to the world, to the powers, as it says, in the heavenly places, that we can be that sign. So that's my prayer for us as we embark on this initiative. So to that end, we have been talking widely with across different churches in both the Anglican sphere and the Orthodox, both Byzantine and Oriental, and looking to draw people into what we're doing here at Trinity in many different ways. And as the heart of that is the appointment of 3 advisors who will be really involved over the next few years in the life of the college. And we have one of them with us here today, and that is Randy Williams, who has agreed to participate in that. He's a graduate of the faculty here, and I won't say much more by way of introducing him, because that's what he's meant to be doing as he speaks to us. So I'll turn over to you in a moment. And then what we're going to do, we'll have a discussion, but we also want to introduce both Darcey Lazerte and Garfield who are going to be, in the next little while, launching a missioner network. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, give you a little bit of a seed of what's happening. One of our seminars will actually focus on that and what that's all about. But I thought we would already get the idea going in people's minds, so that as we launch that in the next couple months, that people will kind of know what's happening there. But for now, let's hear from you, Randy, and tell us a little bit about yourself, your ministry, and how you connect with maybe some of the things I just said.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
Those of you here and those who, I guess, are on the other side of the screen.
We hope.
So glad to have this opportunity, and thank you for inviting me. Lots of things have crossed my mind since Father Jeffrey asked me if I would be interested in doing this. And lots of things are still percolating in my mind as to where to start. And it's easy to say we can start from the beginning, but what then is the beginning? And when I look, my beginning is my background, my culture, who I am. I was raised and baptized in the Anglican Church. But I used to joke with my parents, because we would go to church in Sunday school in the morning, and in the afternoon we went to the more austere Pentecostal church. And that's why I say my parents must have considered that we were really bad kids, or they wanted quiet time to themselves, one of the two. But both denominations served me well. And it was early in or later in my teenage years, when people started to say to me, "We think you're called to ministry." And that frightened me, it really did, because I had looked at priests and looked at Pentecostal ministers and saw what they did, the expectations from people, how I assumed they lived up to those expectations, and I felt that was certainly not for me. I went into education. My whole life has been involved in the church. And as I became older in my undergrad years, I continued to attend church. And whatever church I attended, I got the same message from people. I had opportunities to speak, I led Sunday school, I led youth groups, all of which I was comfortable with. But still within my own heart, I felt this was not quite for me. Years went by, and I was enjoying my teaching, and there was one occasion where I was speaking in a church, at a youth conference, and it was pretty clear to me that God was speaking through everybody else, and I just was not listening, and I wasn't hearing as clearly as I should. And the result is that I went on, as I call it, a walkabout. I was searching. And I prefaced that search with the fact that God truly has a sense of humor. Because I had left the Anglican Church, a group of us, teenagers, who found it quite boring and irrelevant to our needs as young black men. And some left the church totally. I continued with the Pentecostal church and eventually changed to the Methodist church, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And lo and behold, I had an opportunity when I was teaching to teach at an Anglican school. And talking about coming full circle, I could never have seen this happening. I was happy teaching in the public system. One person constantly was persistent and saying, Randy, I think you need to go to this particular school. And I'm thinking, no, I don't. And I will tell you, because my heart and mind and my whole soul goes to public education, to those who are not privileged, the marginalized. It was a challenge, but that's where my heart was. So when this opportunity came to teach in an independent/private school, I shut it down for over a year. And eventually I simply said, okay, I'll go and chat with the head of school. Little did I know that the head of school, I had taught her son. And her response was, if anyone can teach my son to enjoy reading, we need him here. And I became involved in that school. And of course, the Anglican school had a chapel. And I found myself more and more spending quiet time in the chapel. And my call became very clear. I spent time in a non-denominational church. I say I was running, but I'm not quite sure if that was it. I think I was still searching where I was meant to be. And again, God truly has a sense of humor. No one in my years would have told me that I would have believed I would have ended up back at the Anglican Church. I know I'm in the right place. I know that that's where God has led me. And all things are right. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful that my heart was opened, not as willingly perhaps as it should have been, but other people, because people have to see that call in you. And sometimes that's what happens. I mean, I could have had a call and no one else could have seen it, and that would have been counterproductive. So that's sort of my background. So I bring to ministry my educational background. I also have a master's in library information science. My major is history, and my minor was religion. And as I went through my schooling, my undergrad work, it was pretty clear that although I simply said that history and religion were intertwined, God was already moving in a very unique way. And when I went to get my bachelor's in education, what did I do? History, I did religion, and I did guidance counseling. And again, God was moving in unique ways, all very important areas that I would need for ministry in the sense of hearing people, spending time with them, listening to what they say. And I went back to get my master's and thinking that was it. I was going to enjoy being a business and law librarian, and instead I ended back in education. And with education, I ended up here at Trinity, starting part-time. My journey was long. There were lots of times for me to say, no, this isn't for me. teaching full-time and being a part-time student. It was about 8 years, and I've enjoyed the 8 years of study and the 8 years here. But I will tell you, here was the challenge. Lots of interesting courses, none of which I saw myself in. Absolutely none. And I will tell you that on one Tuesday evening, after I was, it was the Sunday after Martin Luther King Sunday, and we had celebrated in our Anglican church, and I had played a real role in that. And I sat in chapel, and we were celebrating a saint who I knew about, but I felt even more distant from. A white male who, to me, represented every bit of colonialization. And I sat there, and at the end of the session, after I had consumed communion, which brought me down very nicely, I spoke to Chris, and I said, how is it possible that we cannot identify whether you want me to identify him as a saint, and Martin Luther King is a saint to me? I said, we didn't even mention him. There was nothing about civil rights, nothing about social justice. And Chris and I started to talk, and it was that year that we started to have a series of guest speakers. Brother Reg, who you've already had, he was my spiritual advisor, and I asked him, would you mind coming and speaking to us? And he did. And I made connections to other black priests primarily in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto. They sowed the seeds for what is now the course of race, I believe it's race, religion, and now diversity. So I am really pleased that Trinity and Chris was open to accept that. There was, in addition, some joy that while I worked full-time, I missed a lot of the day courses, so I had to do independent courses. And that meant that I had some say in what I was able to study. I did papers on Black Anglicans in early, what was then Canada, the struggle of blacks in Upper and Lower Canada, and how when blacks escaped or black loyalists traveled to what we now know as the Maritimes, many of them Episcopalians, but there was no place for them there. I wrote about that, and that's where my interest was. And I'm so glad that Trinity was starting to open up in that sense and realize that we are similar, but many of us are different. And we bring different gifts, talents, and skills. And I will tell you, when I was growing up, I never saw a black Anglican priest. Never. So for me, it was, is this attainable? Now, I entered my studies at a mature age. Thank you for reminding me, Darcey. And but with it came my teaching skills, my teaching talents, my life experiences. And I was able to apply all of that to my studies. And again, I am so grateful. With that, with part of my education, I was already leading anti-racism workshops in our board and anti-black racism. I became a member here of the Trinity Anti-Racism Task Force. In my diocese at present, when we've started an anti-racism committee, I'm on that one. And within my present parish, where somebody who looks like me is very few and far between, it is a church that believes in social justice. And they've been open to learning more. And that's the amazing thing as we now celebrate, not just Black History Month in February, but 365 days of the year. Not just Asian Heritage Month in May, not just Indigenous Heritage Month, but we happily intertwine this in our liturgy 52 weeks of the year. Oh, how every church would do that. It will make people feel more welcome. It will make people feel more accepting. People will see more of themselves. People will see God in each other in different ways. People will be less fearful. I guess I'm not really supposed to give a homily. Okay. But those are my issues, and I think I've gone beyond my time of just expressing my wee bit here. But I have great hope. I have great hope for Trinity. It's on the right path. I think we are leading. In some ways, we still have to catch up. In other ways, but when you do something like this, somebody behind me will say, I see someone who looks like me. And there's hope in the Anglican Church for me. Someone who looks like Garfield. There's hope for me in the Anglican Church. And the Anglican Church wants me. Not that we need you, but that we want you. And we embrace. And God's amazing unconditional love is expansive in the sense that, as you already mentioned, there is no creed, race, or color when it comes to God's love. God embraces us all. And God, through Jesus, teaches us to embrace each other in God's love.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think you've demonstrated why we wanted you, why we love you. Why don't we spend a few moments now just chatting a little bit, and any of you can ask questions. We're feeling our way here. We've not had these positions before, and we're partly governed by just what ideas were around at the time that a grant proposal was put together, but I don't want us to feel constrained by that. So what I would really like is an open, generous way of just thinking about all of these things. I mean, right across everything that we do. You've mentioned the fact that the course was started here, but that's one course alongside a lot of other courses. So I'm always interested in knowing how is it we can review everything that we do in terms of curricula, the bibliographies, even the very themes we set out to explore. But even beyond that, what are the ways that we organize our life together that are possibly, marginalizing at times, that sort of thing? I know there's been an exercise, as you mentioned, at Trinity, sort of looking at some of those things. I mean, tried and true traditions have been called into question for the ways that they were excluding things. I mean, not just students, but I think even some faculty felt excluded. Some staff felt excluded because of the way things are set up and so forth. So the things that aren't noticeable to people who are in the power, who are in the position of authority and everything. But that goes probably for most of us some of the time anyway, right? Whether we're teaching a course, putting a course together, whether we're a leading student in a course, whether we're working in an environment, a parish or whatever, we don't notice the things we don't notice, right? So part of what I see this role being is helping us notice, helping us to open our eyes, helping us to become aware, not always because there's an obvious solution or an immediate solution, but because the being aware is where that wanting and loving and embracing comes from, right?
Absolutely, and allowing space and opportunities for people to ask questions and not feel uncomfortable about asking them. And I suspect that has long happened in the past. People just felt, I don't want to ask this question. I will be looked at as being a troublemaker. I'll be looked at as, I feel that my marks will drop. I feel I'll be penalized. All of those internal fears that, societally speaking, have been inflicted on many people, that if you question something, and if the other person doesn't like it, you'll be penalized.
And it occurs to me as you say that the problem doesn't start here, right? Because people will have arrived here having gone through a schooling system that's probably done that every stage. So what we need to do is not just not have that happen here. We actually have to actively fight against it, right? Because otherwise, the solution isn't in train, right? We have to go out and do those extra things. So anyway, it is a sort of group discussion at this point. So are people that want to weigh in on that, or have you thought about the ways that we can even begin to kind of address some of these curriculum and other issues? I mean, beyond just offering a course here and there, which is clearly not the end of the story, right?
No.
But we're at the stage now we're being asked for our courses for next year, and we're all looking again at our syllabuses, or we've got PhD students preparing their first syllabuses as part of their own process of coming into the field and everything. What are the kinds of considerations that you see that would help us to open our eyes a little bit to possibility here?
Two C words: collaboration, meaning engaging others, and communication. We know in the world of academia that none of us knows all things. And when we're looking outside of ourselves, we have to engage those persons who bring and live their journeys and stories very different from ours, to allow us to look, just have a glimpse. We'll never participate in those lives, but simply to have a glimpse of what's going on. And as you've mentioned, to fight, but I'll say to ally with any group that is considered different or marginalized. We always need and want allies. And when it comes to something like curriculum, there may be a source out there that is nowhere near in our stacks, in our library or Robarts, in the Grand Library or Robarts, but somebody else has that one book. When I did my research for my final paper, can't remember the name, but the subheading was How the Anglican Church Has Let and Continues to Let Black Anglicans Down. We don't leave it in the past. There's always something happening in the present that needs to be addressed. Is it work? Boy, is it ever work. Some days I'm exhausted. When I think that the obvious, that people wouldn't ask questions or make comments, then it's like, wow. So let me give you an example of a church that I was serving in, and I was being introduced. And of course it was in COVID, so we were all online. And the priest said to me, why don't I just introduce you first, and then you'll come on. In other words, I wasn't in view of anyone else. And so he introduced me, and then I came off. And in the group was a blood-curdling, wow! This woman could not believe that there was actually someone black that was connected to this particular parish. Now, the teaching part of me says this: if she is declaring that, there are another 5 or 6 that are thinking that, but are either embarrassed or confused or whatever else about saying that. And that's what we have to look at regarding curriculum also, is not just the obvious, but we have to think beyond that and think, what other questions are being asked here? How can we leap and it's difficult to assume that we will be able to cater a lesson on what we think will be asked. That's difficult. I know that from teaching for decades. But to open our minds, that's the most important thing. Open our minds and see the church as truly being the church. I don't mean the building. I mean us as the church, living the gospel, being missionally minded, and sharing. So again, the curriculum component, there is a growing number of very good resources out there. I would love to see more Canadian church history more inclusive. I mean, I can tell you from a secular history, our Canadian history is white Canadian male history. So when the other groups try to swing, and this is why we have Black History Month, Asian History Month, Latino History Month, Indigenous History Month, because we don't have an inclusive history. And these other groups have had to force and forge their way into what was the established history. All we need to do is just look sadly south of the border and see the extreme methods that are being taken, and sadly, by the church, who's taking some of these steps and supporting other steps that are obviously wrong, to dismantle and disregard other people's histories, other people's histories.
Appreciate you sharing so much of your story, because what's resonating with me as a woman of color is a lot of common touch points and things that aren't so common, right?
Mm-hmm.
The difference between brothers and sisters. But what's sitting with me in particular when you talk about curriculum is the experience of marginalized seminarians as we are prepared to move into parishes. What does it mean for us when we hold double consciousness to hold space for others who respond to us differently? And so who shows up? So I'll give you an example.
Sure.
I'm serving in a parish, and I've chosen, alongside with the priest, to stay in a particular parish to serve until ordination, so that I can practice a particular skill around experiencing racism. I've faced it my whole life. I know how to do that in the secular world. How do you do that as an ordained person, as a shepherd, when people go, whoa, you're going to be my priest, or however that gets expressed, right? So there's a formational and a skill acquisition part that I think is necessary, and whether it's somebody's Black, Indigenous, Asian, it doesn't matter. We all live with a double consciousness, or if you're female, another layer of consciousness as well, in terms of how can I safely show up right now? And so how does that inform those of us being formed for ministry, right? Whether it's lay or ordained. How do we fully show up in our ministry in that kind of a context?
I would say, first of all...
So that's the question around curriculum, right?
Yes. Yeah. I'm just going to tag on to where you ended. The very first thing that I felt was important for me was for me to know myself.
Yeah. Absolutely right. Yeah. See, I'm so glad you say that, because I come to this as well as a mature person who's fully aware of who she is and who she isn't.
Yes.
Or I hope, God willing, anyways.
Who you will be.
Who I will be,
That's
who
right.
I'm becoming. But we have younger students for whom that's not where they're at in their life, right? And so they may not even be aware yet that that's the reality that may present for them as they're preparing for ministry, in internships, in placements, and also when they land somewhere, right?
Yeah. So in addition to knowing yourself and constantly educating yourself, get to know others. I have found in ministry, and I'm so grateful for my background in guidance counseling, to carefully watch people's body language. Their head may be nodding, but the rest of that body may be shouting, "Get me out of here." Or, "How dare she say that to me?" In that sense. It takes training. It took me a long time, for sure. Once you check body language, listen to what people are clearly saying verbally. Are they saying it to appease you? Are they saying it to make them feel good? Are they saying it to make them look good in front of others because it is politically the right thing to say in a church setting? But once they leave that setting, and if you have a scope at their kitchen table, or in their living room, or on the lawn bowling, field or at the bridge table, that's a lot to consider. And I will tell you, one's mind constantly goes and goes trying to figure out. And it is literally a one-on-one. I use the word winning, and I use it cautiously, but I can't think of another word right now. It is winning one person over at a time by telling your story, and they may get tired of hearing it, because we live in a quick, instant society that if it's anything that's more than 10 minutes, you've lost teenagers and many adults now. And that's the way it is. We have to move expeditiously, we have to move cautiously, carefully, yet being the risk takers that we're meant to be. Because if we are not risk takers, we won't move. And if we won't move, society won't move. Much of African American society would not be where it is now if people didn't mobilize. Much of Black Canadian society wouldn't be. I mean, there were some people in one of the churches I was at who was horrified to find out that I actually marched with Black Lives Matter. Don't all lives matter? Absolutely, before God. But there are some lives that matter clearly in society more than others. So when it comes back to our curriculum, carefully choose what you're going to include. And then when you see stuff that is cautious, I would say don't ignore it. Raise it and discuss it. When I did my paper, I can't remember the number of books that were cross-referenced. And I enthusiastically went to, when I looked in the table of contents, a chapter that I thought, this is it. And I found 2 lines. And then having to connect those 2 lines to another half of a line in another resource. We should not have to do that. It is again a way of each of us seeing each other, and for those of us who rarely have seen ourselves, to be proud that we see ourselves in that sense. And as you go out to parishes that are changing, let's face it, there are very few, there are still several, but very few Anglican parishes that are white and British. Those years are long over. What we are having now is an infusion of Asian Christians or Asian seekers, a huge number of Blacks from Africa, and they bring their brand of Anglicanism also. It is not wrong, it is just different, and we need to be able to see where can they fit in. The Caribbean group have been here since the 60s. And they are, they are a group who have seen the Anglican Church of Canada at its worst. And I say that because as a member of Black Anglicans, the stories that I've heard of people who wanted to contribute, they came from their church in Jamaica, Bahamas, Barbados, wherever it was, and they were already in leadership there, and they came and they were silenced because they were not good enough. They were not one of the group that was already here. They were not one of the parish where somebody's name had been there for generations. They were viewed as intruders. And many people left. And as they did in the Maritimes, that's why you have so few Anglican churches in the Maritimes, but the Baptist Church thrives there in that sense. So when we look at our parishes, look to see who's in leadership. Look to see who's really contributing. Look who is being heard and who is not being heard. And listen for the grumblings also. our parishes will invariably continue to change and change drastically.
That's one of the things we don't have here, right? So as a postulant, I can't even count how many times I've done anti-racism training, but that's something that we do with Trin students. And I wonder if that's, part of the formational piece that we need to do here.
That will be
Right.
absolutely wonderful, and I'm glad you raised that, because all of us, each of us, carry inherent bias within ourselves. I mean, I still walk down the street, and I'll walk past a white woman, and we pass, and I still see a clutch closer to the bag there. She doesn't know me, but in her mind, I'm a black male, and that's not a good thing. And I suspect that in our parishes, some of them, those people will think the same thing. And we have to work at changing that. There's that word again. Work at changing it to ensure that people are educated and they're able to speak. And when you talk about that being here, a great opportunity to raise various scenarios with students and see how they respond. Because the shock and awe situation will be real for many of them in some of these parishes.
One of the things that is kind of the ongoing struggle, you hinted at when you talked about the fact that there have to be these special considerations, a month dedicated to this, that, or thing, because there's not a core thing that is inclusive of everything, right? So it's that the ongoing struggle for me is this battle between, okay, how much can we mainstream this versus how much do we need to hold apart because the mainstream is not ready for it, right?
Will the mainstream ever be ready for it?
Well, yeah.
Without some sort of agitation.
Because part of the problem with the word inclusive is that it's often predicated on, well, where I'm standing, these groups were left out. I'll bring them in, but I'll bring them to where I am and just make them. Sure, I'll just be really welcoming to the thing that as it was, right?
Yes.
Rather than challenging and sort of decentralizing everything somehow. So how do you know? I mean, you can't answer this, but I mean, how do you know when it's necessary to do that thing alongside? Like in the 19th century, where churches, as you just said, black churches were formed because people were not welcome in the mainstream church as it was. Now the people in the mainstream church turn around and say, well, sure, you're the racists, you're the ones
that's leading, exactly.
Yeah, and you're welcome here, except you're not really, because we're not going to change anything about what we're doing. So, I mean, it's a big question.
So you tell someone who attends the African Methodist Episcopal Church, who knows that story well, of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, who in the Methodist Church in the 1800s in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, in fact, they were dragged from the altar because they felt they were praying too long. Dragged from the altar. Richard Allen then went off, as well as Absalom Jones, to start the African Methodist Episcopal. I still can't figure out how they got the Methodist and Episcopal together, but that's neither nor in that sense. And that denomination flourishes across our world in that sense. And is it a black church? It is a black church. It addressed black needs. It became the social center. It's because blacks couldn't go anywhere else. They weren't allowed anywhere else. The church became that cultural center, and their bank, and their insurance company, and all of their social well-being. And now people are saying, you're racist because you worship in a singularly raced or ethnic church, when in effect they've forgotten why that happened. And again, as you mentioned, that if they did go to another church, where would they find themselves? Where would their gifts be used? Where would their talents be exposed? Where will they grow? Where will they see each other in sermons? Why don't we recognize black saints? why don't we recognize Asian saints? Maybe we started to. I don't know. You know? And I don't mean recognition by, and this is my feeling, wasting money that could go to social justice and marginalized groups for feeding, etc., by putting up more stained glass windows to indicate that we're accepting of blacks because I have something about Bishop Tutu, or I have something about an Asian missionary who I don't talk about any other time of the year. Why can't we give that money to somebody who's looking for housing? Help somebody who's out in tent city, you know, and say, here we are. The hands, feet, eyes, heart, head of Christ.
Just for background, I have, from my birth, and attended and ministered in ethnic Orthodox congregations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's my thing. But coming back to what you said about allies, last year in the fall semester we did the first cohort course for the PhDs, which is research and scholarship, and you get exposed to all kinds of stuff, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And among the stuff we got exposed to was, you know, the colonialism, all of this stuff that we were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most, how would you say, the most moving, the most touching people on the deepest level parish events that I've ever had as, you know, as a priest in my parish is from that, because of the whole issue with the residential schools, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
and my parish at the time was very mixed. You had old immigration and born there, and after World War II, and after fall of Soviet Union. So there's a gamut of people, plus all the Canadians of various stripes and colors who, you know, come in. It's not a large parish, but very mixed,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have in November, the Ukrainians on the last weekend in November always have this commemoration of the artificial famine, the Holodomor, the genocide that took place in 32, 33 in the Soviet Union, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it was very neat because I floated in October to the parish council that, you know what, maybe this year, we're always talking about Ukrainians and, you know, and what Stalin did and all of this. Why don't we have somebody coming from the indigenous community talk to us about their genocide?
Mm-hmm.
And so we contacted the Mississauga of the Scoobugs, their office up there in Port
Okay,
Barre.
yes, yes.
And they sent a man who did this kind of a thing, you know. And he came in, because we always, after the liturgy, we have a memorial service, and then we go and we have a symbolic luncheon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just some little soup and a piece of bread and like that. And we asked him to speak. And of course he said, I'm not going to speak long, but he spoke for an hour and a half, and you could hear a pin drop the whole time.
Yeah.
And he had a little PowerPoint thing and all, and it was, I would say, transformative for the parish,
Mm-hmm.
because not that they heard anything they probably didn't know, but they heard it firsthand.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
and I think looking for these, you know, nobody likes to suffer, but suffering can really bring you commonality.
Yes.
And looking for any type, whether it's a positive or a negative, where you have a commonality with that other community or that other, you know, church or whoever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those things are wonderful. And I think that's something that, you know, I can tell Father Jeffrey about the Orthodox thing. All our people suffered in one way or another. I mean, that's why they're here in North America, because they ran away from something, right? I mean, you guys know very well, right? And so, from our perspective, you know, whether it would be Afro-Canadian, whether it would be Indigenous, whatever, those are commonalities that you can really use to bring people together, you know, and just respectfully, you know, you don't have to become Orthodox, and I don't have to become Anglican, but we can really find a deep connection there, you know.
And what you've done is you've offered. an opportunity. And you'll never know how many people were thinking, oh, we should have had this a while back. But you've given that opportunity. And this also responds to your question about determining what opportunities when you introduce to the parish, without anyone shouting at you and saying, I don't want you to force this down my throat.
We can bring Darcey and Garfield in now, and they can talk a little bit about what they have in the works, but also in the context in which they're working in the Oakville area and the kinds of ideas and values that are involved in that. So I don't know how you've agreed to present it. Is it?
Well, we thought we'd just tell a little story of how we started and then where we would like to go. And listening to you, Randy, has inspired me. Thank you very much for that. And on a personal level, I was raised Pentecostal and then came over to the Anglican Church.
So you saw the light.
I saw the
There you
light.
go.
But I will say, I thought the Pentecostal church, at least, was much more diverse, at least the one I grew up in. Certainly socioeconomically, but certainly culturally as well. So it took me back to some of those, but I was an undergrad here in the early 90s and discovered Anglicanism and love it. But to get to the Missionary Network, it comes out of a work that Garfield and I began. Too bad he wasn't here, but Bishop Yu came and spoke to the clergy in Oakville because we'd see more and more Chinese people seeking in our services, and he described himself as third wave immigration from China. That means Hong Kong. And what we're seeing now is a fourth wave immigration. And he gave us quite an inspiring talk, and he said at the end of the day, they're looking and seeking, and if you don't do it, someone else will. So at that point, I sent Bishop Michael Bird a little email, actually to his secretary, and said, well, we've had a few Chinese seekers that have come through, but St. Simon's, which is not far from where you are now, has a long tradition of a West Indian community. We've had quite a number of Nigerians and Africans come over in recent years. English people, but with a Southeast Asian background, have come over, some Anglo-Indians, so maybe it's something we want to talk about. So I don't think I've hardly ever gotten a call from a bishop in 25 years of parish ministry, but the phone rang, and he goes, well, Darcey, let's talk, and he said, I think, we'd like to work with St. Simon's on this, and we're thinking of a gentleman named Garfield. I said, well, I knew Garfield, he'd been a student of mine, and would you be interested? And I said, sure. And then we had a very robust conversation about money and who was going to pay for what. And we settled on some numbers, and the Chinese mission and missional work began, I would say, out of St. Simon's, but not in St. Simon's. It was not just meant to be a parish effort, but it was a diocesan effort, mostly focused in and around the Oakville area, and obviously kind of West Mississauga, just because that's how things work. And at that point, Garfield stepped in and became a part of things, and we got it going at this stage. And he's been running with it now for probably half a dozen years.
Starting to fifth year.
Starting the fifth year, so you probably should let people know what's happening now.
Absolutely.
So it started like my first grandson is called Philip. I stepped into Oakville basically into a land of, I know there's some Chinese people there, but I stepped into the church reality is there's no Chinese congregation, as not even a group. I did my internship there, and then after that I was a little bit struggling, and people told me trying to have more opportunities. But thanks to Canon Darcey and all the mentors, Bishop Patrick Yu and Bishop Michael, Bishop Susan Bell, they kind of gave me a lot of support, encouragement, and we moved to their whole family. Started the ministry from a few people, and the second year, I was out in 2018 and started the pandemic kind of after 2 years. It hit the new ministry. We had some good things, gathering a lot of people, events, started a small group, and we started the first worship, which gathered quite a few people at St. Simon's under Canon Darcey's direction. It went very well, but the pandemic hit us hard. I was afraid of losing the new ministry, but thank God it's give a huge support. It turned out we moved to the online, coping with the pandemic. I know it's probably we have that population around that area, and the students and all the lay leaders and work with me hard. We work together. We're getting much stronger than before even. So through the 5th year, we recruited this year I think 7 graduate students until now, and one already went through. It's like me, a bilingual person. It's on the ordination queue. And the Bible study group, right now we have 2 very strong, and worship wise we have associated worship. We connected with solid I think 50 families, something like that, and we have a wider connection with I think over 200 families already. So basically I visited most of them. For 5 years, it's visiting all these things. For the mission itself, it's associated with the let me say 5 parishes right now. Each parishes have each parish have different DNA. For me it's a kind of very hard to start the first one. St. Simon's is the easy one because the Canon Darcey is fully support. For some other parishes, I have to kind of how to cooperate with the institutional church, thinking about the church of like a lot of elements there, the race, color, people, what it is in ministry. The church and the half-time rector right now is very international. If you have time, please come to visit us. I think it's during the Sunday you will find the people from India, from Africa, from the traditional English, British. So it's even the kids. So the kids, the second generation, they pick up the language very quickly. So I have so some Anglican churches joke with me, Garfield, you have kids, we will send the bus. So it's so Sunday school we have 15, even more. So kids running around. It's not a big parish, but the pattern there is I got a few reflections. People love that feeling. I have some. I think Randy just mentioned it. Myself reflecting is am I representing what I'm doing things right? So thanks for I think it's the biggest thing for me is trying to get people together to listen more. I love the words of collaborative and communication. That's the biggest thing. So you have to try to bring people and listen to them and try to get them in. And feel one big family instead of I'm the one come join me or way of. I think it's basically we first time at the missionary work we go to their home and kind of gesture there and tell them this is your home too instead of. We have this, please come join us. So for the missionary work, still in the immature time, but we are making some progress. There's a lot of thinking and reflections. That's why I brought this to Trinity and to Canon Darcey, to Father Jeffrey, and to our leaders group. Is thinking I believe there's a lot of good things happening in each parishes, but we need to communicate each other, know what each other is doing to learn each other. I learned a lot from the conference organized by Toronto, by other groups, by professors. So which I love to jump in all the it's workshops. Each time I learned something. Even my first ministry is a small one. It's called English Coffee. I pick up the name from a conference. I think it's the first year Trinity College. We had. They had that without nothing with the Chinese people. They in the very I think it's not a rural set. Some new people there. They're struggling their language. They had a small coffee group after worship. It's called English Coffee. I think that's that. We started one in the St. Anne's in Toronto. That's my first students practice ministry. I brought that to the Oakville. Right now it's evolved. So we made it another ministry. It's called a Calling Career. It's helping people to new immigrants improve your language skills, find your community, and get faith to engage with the whole society, with the church group, and find your path in your life in Canada, in North American, which chapel, I think the first gathering, there's over 100 person into the church. Half of them maybe first time stepping in the church, get to know there's a church. It's actually missionary. It's actually church helping them to do things.
So I'd add to that. So from a practical perspective, Garfield and I have been having a conversation about this for a decade. And certainly he shared with me his experiences, especially through the pandemic and what's happening. And then I always get the funny thing, you teach on evangelism at Trinity? I get that question quite a lot, but I think it's my Pentecostal background, so it's what I did my further studies in. And within that, I pick up students who are from all over the world, and often they're kind of missional in their outlook, and they relate missionary stories. And I sort of noticed within that not all the missioners are like your typical Anglican or ordained person. A little more entrepreneurial, a sense of go-getters. They don't want to fill up the form so much. Certainly good pastors often, but not that focused. But in the conversations that with Garfield and with the others that have come across my path, and just generally, is they're like, well, I tried this, this didn't work, and there's a desire to kind of build a little bit of community. They're out there on their own, doing their own thing, often with the support of a church body, of course, but really, you're pretty isolated in parish ministry, but at least you have a congregation in and around you. And for the missioners, we've got newer Canadians coming in, other things on the go, and there's not that same solid foundation. So there seemed to be a real desire to connect on that level with other people who are doing similar sort of ministry and similar sort of outreach. So I think we're on for November 23rd, and that's the official launch date, but we want to get the word out a little bit. The desire is just to bring these missioners together, not to tell them how to do the work that they're already doing, but rather to listen to one another, hear successes, hear failures, look at challenges in terms of stewardship, children's and youth ministry, some of the challenges in terms of when do you use your indigenous language, when do you use English, some of the history things. So there's a group of missioners out there that are doing the work that we feel need to be connected. In the old days, we had more robust parachurch organizations that went out and did some of this work, but this seems to be, I think, a movement in the church today which I think Trinity could be uniquely challenged to harness and facilitate.
And I want to certainly laud Garfield's, and now I know yours also, Darcey's, creativity, thought process, being led by the Spirit to plant these different groups in various Anglican churches. And you and I have talked about this, Garfield, not that they remain separate, but they bring their gifts into what I'm using as the main church, rather than having extra worship at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when nobody from the other church is going to come and visit, although there's an invitation extended. We look forward to that. And I think one of those ways, Darcey, that will be helpful also, it's slow going, but the anti-racism committee that I mentioned in the Diocese of Niagara, we are working on a type, literally, of curriculum. Each of us on the team has contributed lessons, and these lessons will be used across every parish. So it's not just anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Brown racism, it's all inclusive in that. So people get a complete package when this rolls out for them. So we're at one spectrum. Trinity's, we have to move closer and closer so that there's a happy blending. And that happy blending occurs, of course, when students here are learning the core, and then they take it out to a parish, and the parish is receptive or not, and we have to be taught what happens if the parish isn't receptive. I mean, we can't say that every priest in Niagara is going to openly welcome this. We know that some won't, simply because of the geographical location.
Part of what we're trying to do with all these various initiatives is to create a kind of critical mass, a hub where things are happening, good practice is shared, and people are encouraged, the way Darcey's kind of outlined there, and a kind of a catalyst, right? So we know not every corner will be touched immediately, but if we can create a lot of good energy around the right sorts of things, and what impresses me about the proposed missioner network that we'll hear more about in November as it launches, but it embeds from the beginning the kinds of things you've been talking about, right? The communication and the listening and being able to bring people in and share their gifts in a full way, right? And as you say, not we're going to do ethnic ministry as a silo, right? We're going to just kind of carve out these things. We'll bring this to the core of it, which is why I wanted to start today with this kind of evocation of the eschatological vision of the church as differentiated unity. If we're all striving at that, right, in all of these different ways, then we can be making progress.
But the church also has to connect to other groups that it affiliates with. I'll give you another story. When you are a postulant or a candidate, you go through, what's the group called? No, not ACCO. It's where you go for, you have a look at yourself. I don't want to say psychological testing.
Oh, it's the psychological testing, the evaluation.
Yes, all of that. And
Yes.
you're sent off to
Yes.
a particular organization. And I'm sitting there, and the very first case study that comes up is a single black woman, unemployed, children, and like the stereotype just went on. And I'm sitting there and thinking, this is the first example that you are using. And I waited for a pause, and we went through 3 other scenarios, none of which was vaguely related. I looked through the others, none of them. So again, we have to advocate, right? It shouldn't have to be me because I'm black advocating for this situation. It could be any of us. And I raised it with the presenter. And what she said to me was, oh, we've been presenting this for years and no one has ever said anything. So the intimation is, why are you complaining? Well, I'm complaining probably because I'm the first black person that you've had come through. I knew that wasn't the case. I was the only black person that would say something. And that's what I mean when I said earlier about the fear of speaking up and being viewed as a rebel rouser. Now, I mean, I just felt, how many people are going to go away from here and think, okay, and I know this is a simplistic example, but I have a single black mother in my parish. And their own story will formulate around that. So I'm pleased to say that after I raised this, and that person was not particularly fazed, until I actually wrote a letter to the bishop, and a letter to the person who was responsible for this, and it was immediately taken off. But really, it had been there for years, and no one said anything. It was such an affront, and it could have been an Asian single mother, a brown single mother. It could have been an indigenous single mother. It could have been a Latino. And we have to reach the stage as advocates that when we see systemic injustice, whatever way it presents itself, that we may not know what to say, but if we just question it.
Notice it first.
Yeah, notice it. Yeah.
Page.
Yeah, I'm curious, what's the definition of mission when we're talking about the missional network? Yeah.
Missioner network.
Missioner. So what's the definition of mission when we're talking about missioner network?
You teach this, Darcey.
Well, yeah, that's why I got so many thoughts in my head. So in some ways, you're self-defining, where we're going after the missioners themselves, those who are outside of, call it, the Anglican traditional norm of ministry. And so I suspect there'll be different understandings of what mission is, but it's really reaching out to new communities that are not typically part of who we are. And there's quite a few groups in Canada that do that.
Okay, so this is, if I think I'm hearing that correctly, it is about building the community of believers beyond the traditional folks we
Building a
have now.
community of those who are involved in missionary work.
In missionary work. Okay.
Yes.
The reason I ask that is because it's my orientation about
It's
mission.
not missional network, missioner network.
Missioner, and that so that's the difference. And so,
Because they're out there working, well equipped
Right.
sometimes, but not always.
Right,
And,
you're right.
we're just hearing from different people. They want to connect and they want
Right.
to just have a place to work through some of the challenges.
right.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that clarification because when I didn't hear missioner, I heard missional, and that's probably my own orientation that's more missional than missioner. And so that raises for me the same kind of questions: is preparing folks to do social mission work, and to help parishes move into that direction to Missio Dei, right? And so when I always hear that, when I hear missioner, it's about the community of believers and not necessarily serving the least of these, which is missional work. And those of us who do that think of ourselves as missioners, right? Regardless of whether those folks become part of the community of believers or not. So that I was just kind of clarification so that I have a sense when it gets launched and I'm talking to other students what it is and what it's not.
I think it includes that, though.
Yeah.
I think, as Darcey is saying, it's by self-definition in a way, right? If you're a missioner, if you're involved in mission.
They're not out of the air on nothing, but there
Yeah.
is some diversity of thought.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Why don't we draw that to a conclusion today in terms of our discussion, but we can stick around and chat. There's coffee and so forth. But I want to thank very much, especially Randy, for agreeing to be part of this process here and to agree to open our eyes and poke and prod a little bit. You are well placed to do that. You have the gifts
Thank you
for that sort of
You
thing. We
inspired me.
recognize
Thank
it.
you.
Yeah, no, all of us. I think it's for sure.
Darcey, I inspired you.
And I don't get inspired. I'm cynical by nature, right? And too long in the church, right? So thank you.
Yeah, indeed. And thank you, both Darcey and Garfield, for
Yes,
beginning
absolutely.
to pique our interest in an upcoming project, and we look forward to hearing more in a few weeks' time. But thank you all for participating today. Our next seminar will be on the neighborhood as the parish. And we are going to have involvement from Jason McKinney, Parkdale, where he has a very, very developed model of what that looks like. Also Molly Finley from St. John's, Norway in Scarborough. They're beginning a project there that involves the whole community. And Jacqueline Daly, St. Margaret's New Toronto, which very much takes on board some of the things that we're talking about today, and also what you've defined as missional, right? The social justice and economic justice piece of all of that. So looking forward to having that in a few weeks' time. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you.